Welcome to you all. My name is Charlie Roger. I am an assistant professor. I'm an assistant professor here at IBEI, and with Leslie Ann Daniels, I am the coordinator of IBEI's research seminar. And this is the first research seminar of the year. The intention of these events is to create a space for researchers from IBEI to present their research.
I'm sorry.
It's a space for researchers from IBEI to present their research and for others from outside of the IBEI community to enrich the discussions that we have here. Do you want? There's a seat over here. No worries. So they're going to be taking place roughly every 2 weeks, every other Monday, and they take place at this exact same time from 1:30 to 3 o'clock. And usually our speaker will be coming and presenting for anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes, and afterwards we'll be having a discussion. We've got an exciting schedule for you this year, and so you can check it out on the IBEI events page. And you'll also be getting notifications about it in your emails. And I hope that you share these widely with your own networks. So our speaker today is Isabelle Anguelovski, who's an ICREA research professor and the director of the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability. Is that right? Okay. And she's the coordinator of several major research projects that are germane to these issues. She was educated in the United States at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and was there for 10 years and before moving here in 2011 to conduct her research. So without further ado, welcome, and I hope that everybody else joins me in welcoming Isabelle to IBEI's research seminar.
Is there a way to turn the screen on?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It feels a bit like an immense responsibility because I'm here for your first seminar of the year. I'm not a professor here, but somehow I feel like the spirit of today will condition a bit how you feel about the master. So hopefully it's not going to go too badly. Thank you also for coming your first week of class. I remember when I was a student, not super too long ago, it was always like the Excel tables of which class do I want to take, what time of the day, and which readings do I have to already do. So I know that it's an uncomfortable moment of the semester, but also kind of excited. So I'm here today to present a little bit different parts of our research agenda at the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability. Everything that I'm going to present is either work that we do as a collective group of researchers, some that are led by our doctoral students, other by postdoctoral researchers, some just by myself only, but in general it's much more global than that. So the question today that I would like to ask you is, are we creating just and healthy cities for all, or all the types of green cities that now every type of urban agenda seems to be encompassing, producing trends of privilege, inequalities, and exclusion in ways that this green city agenda is basically not neutral. It's deeply loaded with a form of inequality that's being reproduced over time. So the talk today is thus entitled Pushing the Boundaries of Urban Sustainability and Climate Planning. For whom are those different cities being created? To just give you a little bit of context about our lab, this is mostly a research and kind of also policy-oriented lab that brings together researchers from different disciplines. I'm trained in urban studies and planning. The co-director of the lab, James Connell, is also trained in the US at Columbia in urban studies and planning. But we also have researchers who encompass public health, political economy, public policy, geography, and sociology, because we are all interested in these questions that are at the intersection of urban studies and planning, development studies, inequality, and environmental planning. The three main research areas that we have so far are the following here. One, which are critical lenses on sustainability. Again, kind of disentangling this relationship between creating healthier, carbon neutral environments, but at the same time, for whom are those environments being created and what processes of exclusion are being reproduced along the way. We're also looking at global urban environments, thinking that we cannot think about the urban just within the boundaries of the municipal or the metropolitan areas. We have to think about the hinterland, the periphery upon which those urban relationships are created, but also upon which we draw resources, we draw people, and we also deplete those rural environments, for instance. We also think in our research about the role that global finance plays in financing greening agendas and in speculating on the urban land, including speculating on green projects. And then another area that we very much care about is the intersection of urban environmental planning, health, and inequities. Thinking that there's a lot of research that needs to be produced, looking at the way in which the environment, the neighborhoods in which we are, the green spaces even that we inhabit are not beneficial for everyone. And that there are deeper conditions in the neighborhoods, in the cities, that will shape the ways in which people relate to green space, to climate resilient infrastructure, to green housing, etc. We have different research projects that underpin our research, some that are funded by the European Union, others that are funded by the Spanish government, and even some by the Ayuntamiento de Barcelona. I'll try to talk a bit about all of them, but you'll see always this relationship between environmental planning and equity and inequalities along the way. What we try to do as well is do a lot of outreach within the local Barcelona and Catalonian community, but also within those boundaries. So we have a summer school on degrowth and environmental justice. We organize dialogues with people from the Diputació, from the Ayuntamiento de Barcelona, with schools as well, with the Public Health Agency, to think about the ramifications of planning green cities that can at the same time provide example benefits for everyone. And we always focus on a specific topic. So for instance, playground and green spaces for kids, river restoration or landscape reparations, and the way in which those also might help towards restorative justice issues, for instance. We also look together with local stakeholders at some of the most interesting and innovative planning projects that are taking place in Barcelona, like for instance the Superblocks, those big new sustainable mobility planning processes and infrastructure that the city of Barcelona is putting together. And then, because we are also a research and academic institute, we do a lot of courses on issues related to urban environmental justice. A page that I also wanted just to draw you towards is our blog series on urban inequalities, green inequalities, where different researchers at different stages of their research, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's interns, sometimes it's master students who are also looking to gain visibility in their professional practice, who write on a particular topic that has to do with green inequality. So for instance, here on that short blog, I talked about the ways in which this image, which is a representation of the Boston Harbor Plan, which is a plan released by the city of Boston last year to entirely green the waterfront of Boston with green infrastructure as a way to produce climate resilience, but without considering who will be displaced along the way, either because of real estate speculation processes or just because of homes being destroyed through the process of green infrastructure. So I'm talking about here the speculation of green climate resilience, for instance. Then here we have one of our former research interns who was a master's student who looked at the way in which new instruments of green financing in cities, which are called green bonds. San Francisco has some, Gothenburg has some, in Sweden, help as a way to finance green climate mitigation projects, but without considering at all whether those projects have a deep climate or carbon impact, and without even considering who are benefiting from those projects. So she kind of deconstructs these green bonds as really, are they really green, and also are they socially just? So I go back to my initial question. For whom are green and healthy cities? And that's a bit the leitmotif of today's talk. And why does it matter? Why does this intersection of environment, health, and equity come together in our research? It comes together because of a tradition both in social movements and in academia that is linked to environmental injustice. which is basically, as a definition, the fact that traditionally lower income residents, people of color, and minorities tend to suffer to a greater extent from exposure to environmental toxics, from contamination, from poor access to green space in comparison with white and with wealthier residents. And you can see here those inequities if you think about the way in which people, we in our daily lives, relate to our environment. There are these deep inequities that can also be related to fresh and affordable food access, for instance, healthcare access, healthy housing, all of those ways that produce a healthy body and a healthy mind that is inequitably distributed by race and class and ethnicity and gender in our cities. And that has deep ramifications for something that's very much connected to environmental injustice, which are health inequities. Health inequities, which are disparities in health that are systematic, that are avoidable, and they are unjust. If you just look, for instance, at the life expectation for Esperanza de vida, now I just forget the word in English. Life expectancy, thank you. Per district in Barcelona, you can see that the poorer districts of the city, which is Ciutat Vella, has the lowest life expectancy by almost 2.5 years in comparison with, let's say, the median life expectancy in the rest of the city. And this is also very important because, as I was trying to say at the very beginning, our environment has an impact on our health. Just taking here, for instance, green space. In general, high exposure to green space is associated with an 8% lower risk of all-cause mortality. So there is a deep quantification that's taking place right now in epidemiology, looking at the relationship in which, again, our urban environments shape our health as residents. And if we try to put images a bit on those processes of environmental justice, what do we see? We see that those started early on. If you look at this picture from New Orleans in the US, you can see that Claiborne Avenue, which is this avenue here, which is an oak tree-lined avenue in the 1950s, within an African-American middle-class neighborhood, was a beautiful, available green space for recreation, leisure, and also carbon sequestration. And then in the 1960s, the federal government comes in, let's tear that neighborhood apart, let's build this highway, which is called I-10, to bring back to the city all of those white residents who had moved to the suburbs within this process of white flight to the suburb. We tear this neighborhood apart, we scar it for life, and at the same time, we create new forms of environmental contamination for the African-American residents who are living there. So this process is like 50 years old. But then it continues, it is pervasive over time, and it manifests in different ways. This is another neighborhood in the US, it's called Manchester in Houston. It's also historically an African-American neighborhood, now has a higher proportion of Latinos. And what do you see here? You see a spatial juxtaposition between the existence of an oil refinery, a chemical complex, and playgrounds, schools, and residences. And so again, this kind of injustice and discrimination by race and ethnicity. And now we also see it in Barcelona. Here you can see this neighborhood, which is called the Trinitat in Barcelona, where this park, which is called the Parc de la Trinidad, that was built in the early 1990s, is a beautiful green space, but surrounded by these high-ray interchange systems. So yes, you have access to a green space, but you are highly contaminated, both air and noise at the same time. So a deep environmental injustice. And there are other domains like food, for instance. Community gardens are also more available in wealthier neighborhoods, and nowadays, even in those neighborhoods that where the community gardens were built by people of color, are now becoming community gardens for hipsters. I'll talk about that in a minute. You might recognize yourself as hipsters. I might be part of that category as well, if I think about community gardens in my neighborhood. And there are many ways to illustrate these inequities. For instance, from this data of Los Angeles, you can see that white and Asian residents have a much greater access to acres of green space, to quality green space in comparison with Latino and African American residents. But what's happening now, and it's been probably for the past 10 years or so, is that cities are embedding green planning and the creation of green space, green infrastructure into an agenda that brings together climate resilience, but also beautification, well-being, and also just in general greater access to recreation in cities. Our cities now are places where the creative class, where investment is coming back. And there are places also where now different types of urban strategies are being articulated. But the way they are articulated, if you dissect those documents, is that they are done in ways that are neutral. This is going to be a good for everyone. This is going to bring business. This is going to bring money. This is going to bring economic growth. And this is going to bring value. And here what we're trying to deconstruct is actually, this is not a value neutral project. And why? Just to give you a snapshot, you probably know the High Line in New York, which is this beautiful linear park in Chelsea, where now this building that was built just in 2007 by Zaha Hadid Studio, the famous now deceased architect, you can buy the penthouse on the top for $50 million. So yes, green privilege, even more than green privilege, it's uber privilege for a few. And then closer to us in Barcelona, you have a bit of the equivalent of the High Line, which are the Jardins de la Rambla de Sants. You also have our Superblocks projects. And so the question we ask is, are those benefits for everyone, for long-term residents who live there, or are they also now going to be creating enclaves of displacement of socially vulnerable residents? And so, in a way, the punchline for my talk today is the fact that green amenities are not neutral, and they can create conditions for the social and spatial exclusion of the most vulnerable residents, their livelihoods, and their practices. And in that sense, parks, greenways, climate-resilient infrastructure, even urban farms or gardens are becoming green LULUs, which are green locally unwanted land uses, in racially mixed and lower-income neighborhoods. The word green LULUs is a bit of a pun on a word in the planning literature, which is a LULU, a locally unwanted land use, which traditionally refers to toxic waste sites, contaminating industries, places that are brown, like a brown field, a contaminated river, for instance. That's a LULU. What we are saying here is that actually maybe those green infrastructure are not as beneficial as they look like for everyone. So how does that mean, or what does that mean for theory, and what does that mean for research? It means that what we are trying to do is bring together the literature on urban transformation and gentrification, which is a long-standing literature that defines gentrification as transformations in a neighborhood built, retail, and social environment, together with demographic changes in directions where residents with higher socioeconomic and racial status come to inhabit a neighborhood. And it's traditionally accompanied by housing prices that are higher over time. And what we're saying here is that environmental gentrification is a piece of gentrification, or is a new avenue for gentrification to be produced, because it's the creation of new environmental inequalities or new social inequalities produced by environmental change. And so this is a field that we really aim at contributing to a lot in our research, again, kind of decirculating this relationship between positive exposure to new, pristine, clean environments and health or equity. How do we do that if we think about, okay, how do we come to study that? What we look at is urban greening. So urban greening is our, let's say, composite independent variable that we say, okay, we have to think of different types of greening projects. They might be greenways, they might be gardens, they might be permeable pavements and climate resilient infrastructure. They will have different size, they will be differently accessed with the city, their amenities will be different, and their location will be different as well. And so the question is, how do those different spaces shape gentrification? That is, changes in those demographic and real estate variables. So we're doing that, and that's where I would like to bring some examples here to the table. We do that in a variety of cities in Europe, in North America, and also in some places in the global south. We also try not to be fundamentally and completely naive by also adding the fact that, okay, it's not all about greening producing displacement. There are other variables that we need to think about. For instance, maybe that neighborhood already had a decrease in crime rates over the time that a green space was built. Okay, so then crime rate also plays a role in understanding gentrification. Gentrifiers are attracted by safe neighborhoods. Maybe the transit access around that neighborhood changed, and so provided greater attractiveness. What we also think about are contextual variables. Maybe green gentrification is different in a shrinking city, in a shrinking economy like Leipzig in the 2000s, Manchester in the 2000s, Detroit, Cleveland, than it is in places like Austin, Boston, Bristol, Vienna, etc. And of course, there are other contextual variables that we bring into consideration, including what types of policies are put in place to address gentrification threats. So how does it look like? And that's where I would like to present some of the results from our Green Lulus project, which is this ongoing project we have at the lab, one of our most important ones now, that's going to run for another 2 years, and that started in 2016. So what did we do with Green Lulus? What have we been doing so far? We've asked the following question. What is the magnitude of green gentrification in 40 cities in the US, Canada, and the United States? And what is the relationship between green gentrification and health? So first of all, we conducted an analysis of 99 urban green trajectories where we looked at the ways in which cities anchored greening in their redevelopment. Was greening part of climate resilience? Has greening been part of brownfield redevelopment? Has greening been part of improving access to recreational opportunities? And how in general has it been taking root over time? We've produced a book which is called Green Trajectories. It's free if you want to have a look at it. Municipal Trends and Strategies for Greening in our 99 cities. And we have different portraits. We have different trajectories there that we analyze to show the way in which different champions, different agendas have come together to produce these livable green cities. What we've done also, because we've had thousands and thousands of documents that we've dissected, is trying to code the documents along several criteria to understand how greening was done. So we looked at, okay, how strong is the greening rhetoric? How much do cities brand themselves as green? How much is greening integrated into urban planning? How much has been implemented? And then also, how much consideration has been given to social equity? And one of the questions we've asked through this analysis is, to what extent does greening predict city affordability? Because again, we're interested in inability of residents to benefit from green space, to remain in a neighborhood that has green infrastructure. So basically, if they cannot afford to live, they're going to get out. And so our analysis, which used different types of correlation and regression analysis, showed that there is a high positive correlation between a high level of greening rhetoric, especially so for cities that have greened early and that have a very intense discourse around greening, and high levels of unaffordability, even controlling for population size and economic measures that can address those inequities. So in the end, green boosterism is tightly intertwined with urban revalorization that leads to less affordability and lesser access to all groups to the benefits of urban greening. Vancouver being the epitome of such a relationship, for instance. And then we've started running other analysis. That analysis that James conducted last year is an analysis of New York City, which showed that the areas that between 1990 and 2014 became the greener, which were all of these areas that with darker polygons, are also those areas that, from a correlation standpoint, intersect with the areas that gentrified the most, which are all of the gridded areas there. So you can see that there is a dynamic that starts coming to Earth. Then we also run a pilot study before our 40 city analysis, which we are doing now, of Barcelona, where we said, okay, Barcelona had a very strong green agenda in the 1990s and 2000s, especially so around the provision of local neighborhood parks. You can see it's a pretty gray city in addition, or except for Collserola and Montjuic, but it was doing, as a municipality, a lot of efforts to add new parks and city gardens to the local fabric. And so what we tried to do here through a spatial regression analysis was to try to understand, okay, we are going to calculate how the social demographic composition of areas around the park and how real estate prices around that park changed over time after a green space was added. And so we had this kind of composite indicator of gentrification where parks, in a way that had a score of 3 or 4 in our gentrification variable, became green gentrification park. And so what we saw is that approximately 60% of the new parks created between 1990 and 2006 in Barcelona can be considered green gentrified park. especially those here along the waterfront, which are also linear parks, and that were accompanied during that time by a process of neighborhood rebranding and redevelopment. What we also saw, interestingly enough, is that there was a shift of population from the global south, so more socially vulnerable residents, and residents without a bachelor's degree and lower income residents from these parts of Barcelona towards the north. And so on paper you think, well, it's great. These people now have access to those green spaces, except that those spaces are surrounded by greater contamination than those that are here. The housing stock of those areas is also lower quality, and let's say the retail and the job environment is also less attractive. So this was the park that I mentioned earlier, like you had all of the highway system around. This is a park next to La Meridiana. So you are surrounded by contamination. Yes, you have access to parks, but in a way, you see a form of resegregation of Barcelona with a greater density of people from the global south and lower income residents in those less, let's say in a way, maybe attractive parts of the city, again, from an environmental standpoint. Then last year we did a similar pilot study in DC. And what we added there is also the construction of community gardens. So you can see some of them here, like Noise Garden, etc. With the fact that we ended up with 35 different spaces, and there where we were able to analyze is the fact that the type of park that seems most conducive to gentrification are community gardens, which are actually all of those spaces here. So that kind of debunks a bit the literature on community gardens that has portrayed garden as a place of refuge, as a place of food justice, as a place to address food deserts in historically more deprived neighborhoods. In DC, gentrification and greening are deeply associated with the demographic change around those community gardens. And the most significant predictor of green gentrification in DC is the loss of non-Hispanic blacks. All of those areas that you see in dark blue are the areas that lost in greatest proportion their proportion of non-Hispanic blacks, which is very important because DC used to be a majority black city, and now for the first time in 2016 it has become, there are only 47% of residents who are African American. And that's an example of one of those gardens, is that all around the gardens you have these new condo developments that sell for much higher value than they used to sell, and they just have a direct view on the garden. Photo is not the best because I took it in December. That's why it's not really green, but I have to go back. Then we also did a study, we just finished it and published it in Urban Climate, on green resilience and gentrification. That's a study that Galia, one of our doctoral students, did, Galia Chokri, where she looked at Philadelphia. Philadelphia historically has had a lot of issues with stormwater management because of a combined sewer system where when precipitation are very intense and very high, gray water or sewage water gets combined with potable water. So you can just imagine the mess there. So the city, in order to address these stormwater management issues, has decided to engage in a big greening campaign. And so that's kind of how Philly wants to become. And so what Galia has shown through her research is that gentrification, the areas, the census tracts that most gentrified between 2000 and 2010, which are the dark blue polygons, are areas that over time captured, especially in the recent years, the greatest proportion of green resilient infrastructure, which in a way reconfigures issues of vulnerability and security in cities. I know you have a program here that's on security. We also got to think very much about climate security, which is that residents who tend to be lower income and black residents are not protected by green climate infrastructure. So they are more exposed to storm, to public health diseases that are associated with storms, and they are the ones who have the least resources to cope with those climate impacts. Similar maps here where basically what she showed is that the areas that gained between 2000 and 2016 the greatest proportion of Hispanic residents and black residents, which are those areas that gain the least amount of climate resilient infrastructure. So again, there is an inequity, there is a stratification of who benefits from greatest climate security in relationship to their income, or in that case, to their race. So you end up with kind of privileged residents who are the ones who, by moving into a particular neighborhood and attracting green resilient infrastructure, build these new relationships of climate privilege or environmental privilege in ways that provide them with greater protection while displacing those more fragile residents to climate unprotected zones, for instance. And I will spare you the whole theory building of this paper, but all of this to say that with climate resilient infrastructure, you can produce new enclaves of climate privilege and also new value capture, because the homes of those residents that are in climate protected areas have increased in value, while those of black residents have decreased in value through time. We also were part of this podcast from WBUR, which is a really great public radio station in Boston, that shows that as Boston pursues climate resilience, some shows that it might, or some warn of signs of inequality. Because, as I was hinting at with the blog post earlier, because the climate resilience plan does not accompany green planning with public and social housing. And it doesn't accompany this plan with ways in which buildings that are now coming together, like this building here, for instance, the way that it's been erected actually creates new ways for water to flood into the basement of adjacent social and public housing. So this building, which is super climate resilient, is built on higher ground. It's surrounded by this new future green space. Wonderful for the people who can afford $500,000 for a studio. But the public housing residents behind, because of the slope, if you will, of the streets, the way that the building has reconfigured the streets, are all going to get stormwater into their basement. So again, these kind of inequities being reproduced by climate resilience. We've also studied that by looking at different time periods. That's a paper that James and I are writing now, looking at Boston in particular, where we show that the relationship between greening and gentrification changes over time. In the 1990s, it was a very, in a way, innocent process, where the addition of green space actually did not produce any form of gentrification. But then the most recent period, which is the period now that cities are embarking into their climate and their green agenda, shows tremendous amount of gentrification. And we also see a different relationship by type of green space. As I was hinting at for DC, gardens matter and greenways matter as well. So here, the type of implications that we're trying to draw is try to think as a city about the ways in which the type of green space you will build will require you to really associate green space construction with other social measures or public measures of land control, rent control, or rezoning, so that more socially vulnerable residents are protected. Recent research also that we did in Medellin, just also to show you about what we've been doing in the Global South, shows very similar types of dynamics. In a way, they are almost more acute in some ways. So in Medellin, what do you have? You have a project that's called the Cinturón Verde Metropolitano, which is a green belt all around the city. Medellin is in a valley called the Aburra Valley, and then it's surrounded by beautiful slopes. Okay, great. The problem is the slopes are mostly inhabited by informal residents, people who have migrated because of the armed conflict to those slopes. And so what the city of Medellin is saying is, we have to stop growing. We have to also protect ourselves from landslides and mudslides that will be accelerated because of climate change. So let's build the Cinturón Verde. The Cinturón Verde is divided into different zones. One which is this green area, which is environmental protection and restoration of the local ecosystems. Then you have a transition zone where some biking activities, some recreational activities are being allowed. Then you have a transportation corridor, which is a big controversy. And then here you have what's called the consolidation zone, which is okay, there have been some informal residents coming to densify a neighborhood that's mostly formalized. Let's try to consolidate that area. The problem is that, again, this is not a neutral project. This is how the green belt looks like. It's a very formalized space that is meant to create a border, a boundary against urban growth. And it goes all along the valley. There have been, of course, as many of these types of projects, relocation controversies and an overestimation of risks. Local university voices, those who are specialized in estimating risk, were not consulted at all as part of this process. And they were saying many homes that were demolished could have saved because the risks were actually able to be mitigated. But these houses got destroyed. So risk, the estimation of risk, is always a political process. Then there is also a form of selective displacement. All of these luxury buildings that are in the poblado that are above the line, that is the allowable line or the allowable altitude to be built, in the Cinturón Verde project, they didn't have to go. And actually, there are also 2 more high-end real estate projects that are in the protective zone that are moving forward. So again, inequities in controlling risks and in managing future risk. There is also a military zone right in the middle of one of the comunas, one of the informal settlements, even though according to the land use regulations of the city, this is prohibited. And even though actually this is not even an area that is victim of high crime. So people feeling surveilled, people feeling controlled, people feeling removed from their usual place of residence. And then the green space itself is also very formalized, it's very manicured. It is built, or this green belt is built in ways that people's traditional relationship to land, the trails they use, the type of natural erosion or anti-erosion measures that they had designed, all of this got pushed aside or invisibilized for this much more formalized infrastructure that is part of the new Medellin, the new modern Medellin, and the way it's trying to attract creative classes. Gardens that are also very much part of the residents' social cohesion, structure, ability for residents to build a new place after having been displaced by the countryside, those have also been eradicated, and the program of urban agriculture has been formalized in this Greenbelt process. And just to give you a quote of how residents, or some residents, perceive that project, they say, the Jardín Circunvalar, which is a small part of the Cinturón Verde, is the redemption of Medellin. And it is created for skilled and prepared residents able to professionally compete, and for tourists who consume in those new spaces. The Jardín Circunvalar is not built for the people with little education and little ability to survive in the urban capitalist economy. Those are the ones who end up being expelled from their houses and facing again multiple threats, multiple forms of social and health and food risks. There is now the idea of false and impossible competition between residents of comunas and higher classes that are now the emblem of the new Medellin. So a city that was historically seen as a high insecure area, a city, at the epitome of the war, now rebranding itself, which there are a lot of things that are very positive about that process, but what we're also trying to show here is that, again, it's not a value neutral change. And then kind of finishing on these different relationships, what happens if we add health back in our relationship? What about the health of those residents who go through processes of green gentrification or even just gentrification? Does everyone's health benefit? And so a study that one of my colleagues, Helen Cole, just finished in New York City, which is a study, again, looking at the relationship of where do people have access to greater proportion of active green space, which are the dark green areas, and also separating neighborhoods that have changed demographically over time between gentrifying neighborhoods, in a way too poor to gentrify neighborhoods, and already rich neighborhoods. What Helen and us found is that only the health of privileged residents in gentrifying neighborhoods benefited from high exposure to green space. But then the two poor neighborhoods or the two wealthy neighborhoods, if you will, did not benefit from high exposure to green space. And so that's also very important to understand that the protective effects of green space on health are, again, very inequitably distributed. And we need to think about what types of neighborhoods is being concerned and who benefits within those neighborhoods. In gentrifying neighborhoods, people, and what we are seeing here in our new research in Boston and Barcelona, is that residents who live in these kind of new green neighborhoods are actually exposed to many more individual health outcomes that are negative than those who live sometimes in working class but very socially cohesive neighborhoods where they find social networks of support. So what we see here in our study of Boston and Barcelona is that gentrifying neighborhoods, the residents that are the gentrified ones, suffer from higher suicide thoughts, depression, stress, cardiovascular disease, respiratory diseases, obesity, and sleep deprivation, like deep acute health outcomes that are linked to the fact that their gentrifying neighborhood has now, or is now offering them with poor quality healthcare, issues with public school quality and safety. There is increased drug dealing and consumption, and not just by people who cannot cope with seeing their housing prices go up, but also with gentrifiers who come in and recreate new drug networks that were previously eradicated. People who have high access to cash, to easy money, and then all of a sudden they recreate those drug rings in neighborhood. I can just tell you the example of my neighborhood, San Pedro, Santa Catarina, just close to here. We have different legal and illegal marijuana smoking places that are also embedded in a deeper heroin and cocaine economy. That would not happen if my neighborhood hadn't become a highly touristy and gentrified neighborhood. I can certify that. Multiple forms of insecurity that people face, both on the street, but also because they are afraid of losing their home, that's now being speculated upon. So all of this to say that the process of gentrification, again, is not something that is to be taken lightly. And that's also what we try to argue here, is that it has deep, acute consequences for people's health and well-being. And so just to finish with briefly this last section of the talk, what policy, what planning measures and processes can cities do to try to counteract a bit these negative impacts of gentrification, green gentrification on people's lives? So can we imagine green and equitable alternatives? What do we have here? And so that's kind of the newest research we've been developing now. What we see from going back to the Green Lulus project, what we see is that when municipalities, as soon as they become greener, embed social equity outcomes and goals within their planning and within their financing process of different urban projects, then they can better control cost of living. That's the example of Nantes, for instance, at the western tip of France, where Nantes was elected the green capital of Europe in 2013, but Nantes had embarked in a greening process since the late 1980s with the closure of the shipyards, and the shipyards being these really large brownfield sites that were reconverted into both green zones, even like longitudinal green zone, not just a small park, but also being accompanied with different types of social housing, of public housing, of very different types of them. And not the tiny amount that we see in Barcelona, which is like 1.5%, 2%. We're talking about 25, 30% of different types of public and social housing schemes that allow people not only from a very deprived social background, but also middle class background, lower middle class background, to benefit from a greener and more sustainable neighborhood. What Nantes has done as well is to create those ZAG zones. A ZAG zone in an area that the municipality designates as an area which will be managed by a public company that might have some private actors there as well, which will be deciding what will be the land use of an entire redeveloped area. So it's a little bit in a way like the 22 Arroba, the 22 at in Barcelona, except that you have a company that will say, here, we're not going to have 4-star hotels all next door to one another, as now is happening in some parts of Poblano. We're not going to have that. We're actually going to have a daycare, a school, different types of subsidies for small businesses. We are going to also have a whole green economy where there will be horticulture, landscape architects, people who manage stormwater that will have an entire building for them to grow an economy that's both green and that can be accessible and benefiting people from different educational backgrounds. So it is not a form of kind of speculative greening as we see increasingly in the US, for instance, but it's very much embedded within the social and economic fabric of the city. So it's a very interesting model, and I'm not saying there are no issues with it, but at least what we see is that Nantes has remained deeply equitable from an affordability standpoint over time, despite having also become an increasingly green city. And that's this whole area here that's called the island of Nantes, l'île de Nantes, that used to be a huge brownfield site where all of the shipyard industry was located, and that transformed into those very mixed-use, kind of top-down planned district, yes, but also bringing together a lot of residents to co-create green spaces. The public housing also, the social housing in Nantes, is beautiful. It is not a place that is being discriminated against or that is being stigmatized for its appearance or for the low-quality housing. the eco-districts that exist there are not eco-districts for, former hippies transformed into hipsters, but for people who've lived there for many years and also deserve those types of projects. What I'm talking about in terms of co-creation is that no one sees green spaces as a place that have to be activated and that have to be constantly co-managed and co-recreated over time with residents. So there's a famous Nantes artist who is called, what is his name? Anyway, his name just escaped. But anyway, he's famous for building different types of chicks and also having these chicks in movies, in books, etc. And so what he did during one of the festivals in one of those green spaces is to build one of those chicks based on different types of green materials. And then the city of Nantes made a call a week before that chick was inaugurated and say on that particular day, we want 20,000 families from Nantes, like not 5 or 10, 20,000 families from Nantes to come and build together, so that was one of the spaces, different cushions and pillows for the chick to rest, because otherwise the chick's going to be tired. And so they had all of these cushions built around the chick, then scattered around the garden, and different types of workshops linked to reading, linked to ecology, took place during that festival. So that was just an example, and it took not only 2 weeks to put that together in terms of the length of the activity, but there was an economy that was also linked to it, and an educational and a kind of social cohesion benefit. It was really a really interesting project. What do we have in Barcelona that has this potential for green and equitable greening? The Superblocks. Are there an example of this? That's what we are studying in some of our projects, where what we are seeing is that there is a vision of the city of Barcelona, at least the current municipality, to think, first of all, from an equality standpoint, meaning we are not only going to have a few emblematic super areas in the city, even though that's what it looks like now, but have it all around the city so that it both addresses climate mitigation needs. We have high issues of contamination, air pollution here, together with issues linked to climate adaptation, heat islands effect. So let's have those interventions all around the city. Let's cut traffic, let's change the bus network, and let's create new public spaces at the center of the Superblocks. So that's the idea here. If you haven't been there yet, it's to activate those corners with new green spaces, with new playgrounds, to add to the amount of green space of Barcelona and also address both mitigation and adaptation goals. What's interesting in the project is that the city is quite aware that this is going to create a lot of speculation. And it has already, if you look at San Antoni, or even if you look at the Superia in Poblano that was inaugurated 3 years ago, the prices around those superias are really, really much higher than 500 meters below or beyond. But there is a scheme to accompany superias by new public housing. So as long as you have a way to integrate housing for people who might be expelled from those areas because of speculation or because of higher rental prices, then you might also have a greening process that's more equitable. And then superias also need to be activated spaces for the elderly, for daycare, for schools, so that different types of education activities, visits, contact with the outdoor can be promoted. Especially so because, for instance, elderly residents are very much at risk of social exclusion and isolation. So how can those superias be new spaces for encounter, for instance? You also have to think, or we also have to think about parks that can create relational well-being. And that's a research from, her name got Carmen Perez del Purgal, who is one of our doctoral students, who compared different parks in Barcelona. And what she saw is that the parks that were built in working class neighborhoods together with residents and without thinking about a rebranding process of that entire neighborhood created greater well-being among kids. So she compared the Parc Central de Nou Barris, which is historically in a working class neighborhood of Barcelona, with the Parc del Centre de Poblano, which was created as part of a big rebranding of Poblano, like the technology area, the area with new office spaces, etc., fully gentrifying, built by the famous French architect Jean Nouvel. That space that's in Poblano, fully gentrifying as well, does not produce relationship of well-being for kids. Kids only stay there, that's what her research shows, for a few minutes, parents leave very quickly, Kids are very controlled. They don't explore the park. They all coalesce around the playground on their way to other activities. And they don't dare to explore the playground. So the whole idea of play, free play, that is now promoted by psychologists and by planners is not taking place in Poblano, while it is very much taking place in Nou Barris, because it was co-created by residents and because also it's created places of proximity where also informal relationships of support and care became constructed over time between parents. So there is a sense that kids can build confidence, they can build freedom, free play, and they are supervised but a loose supervision, whereas in Poblano it's not the case. There's also another interesting project in Barcelona which is adapted schools to climate change. I don't want to extend myself too much on that, but it's also very much a co-creation of improved living quality in schools, especially those with high mixity and high kind of concrete type of schools. You can see some of those school patios have zero green space. So how can we take advantage of climate funds to build more green, but also more socially welcoming spaces? The city has also a really interesting program we've been associated with, which is a rooftop garden program for people with disabilities. That program is amazing because it completely reconfigures and transforms the relationship that people with disabilities have with themselves and with the city. They have a space of freedom, they have a space of exploration in the garden that they don't have generally because they are so controlled by the social centers, by the structures that take care of them every day. They also see themselves, because of this garden, as providers of services, providers of food, rather than being recipients of social help. So it completely switches mentally their sense of relevance in society and give them much greater confidence and well-being. So it's really an amazing process of transformation and of confidence. And it also changes the way in which the different technicians that have built the green space with the residents see their work. They're like, we had to change our pedagogy. We had to think about different ways in which we rethink our practice. And then community-driven resilience for climate change can also be something that's co-created with residents. That's an example of Boston, where climate leaders from the community are building resilience from the bottom up, rather than just with these big green infrastructure projects that now Boston has. Similarly in DC, a neighborhood that's called Anacostia, which is in this part of the city, historically black, this project that is meant to be a green bridge across the river, reconciling a much wealthier white community here that's called the Navy Yard with Anacostia, is meant to also have what's called an equitable development plan, meaning land trust, housing that is being for different types of income groups, and also giving land back to residents who historically are black and who lost that land post-slavery. So it's going back deep in time and in space to who owned the space, what can be repaired via these greening projects. And I'm just concluding here with saying that urban greening and green space, yes, are vital to ecological health, to physical health, but achieving equity in health and reducing health inequalities should go much beyond thinking that adding a new green space or adding a climate resilient infrastructure is going to have an impact on those indicators of health. And so the questions we are exploring now, and I'm happy to talk a bit more about that, is more related to policies. What urban policies mitigate the impact of gentrification on socially vulnerable residents, thinking about community development policies, jobs, education, health and housing. What land use planning tools can help mitigate the impact of displacement, for instance? What policies can maximize human well-being and at the same time ecological well-being in ways that cities are resilient to climate impacts? And I'll finish here. Sorry, my voice should have gone down, but it went up. Thank you so much.